The chamber had been empty for 11 years when Counselor Veth Ara finally allowed herself to walk through it. She had avoided it deliberately. Everyone had. The seat allocations had been redistributed within 72 hours of the expulsion vote, the human delegation's access codes revoked before their vessels had even cleared the orbital approach lane. The physical space itself had been reassigned, storage, then a secondary communications relay, then storage again, as though the Galactic Council's administrative staff couldn't quite decide what to do with a room that had once held something they no longer had a category for. But the chair was still there. Veth Ara didn't know why. No one had ordered it removed, and apparently no one had thought to. It sat slightly offset from where it had been bolted to the floor, as though someone had moved it and then changed their mind, and it was the angle of that chair, that particular specific wrongness, that made the cold feeling move through her thoracic cavity like a current. She stood there for a long time looking at it. The vote had been 11-2 with one abstention. She had been one of the 11, she remembered that clearly. What she didn't remember, what she had over years worked to convince herself she didn't remember, was the expression on the human ambassador's face when the final count was announced. Not anger, not grief, not even surprise, something quieter than all of those. Something that at the time she had categorized as defeat, because defeat was a state she understood. Defeat produced withdrawal. Defeat produced compliance. She understood now that she had been catastrophically wrong about what she had seen. But she didn't understand why yet. That was what had brought her back to this room. That was why she had pulled the archive files, reviewed the record, ordered the deep analysis on human activity in the 17 systems the Council no longer formally acknowledged. She was trying to understand what, exactly, humanity had been doing for 11 years in the space they had been expelled to. And the more data she reviewed, the more certain she became that the answer was going to be worse than anything she had prepared herself for. She was right, but not in any direction she had anticipated. The expulsion itself had been clean by the standards of interstellar governance. That was the word the Council's official documentation used: clean. Humanity had been a member species for 31 years, a relatively short tenure, but long enough to have accumulated 17 treaty agreements, 4 mutual defense pacts, and an ongoing cultural exchange program that had at various points produced minor diplomatic incidents due to human behavior that other member species found difficult to interpret. The humans were, in the consensus language of the era, complicated. They had arrived in Council space with an enthusiasm that bordered on alarming. They formed attachments quickly and at unusual depth. They had a tendency to continue pursuing goals past the point at which rational analysis suggested cessation. They were physically resilient in ways that the initial xenobiology surveys had described, but that no one had quite believed until they saw it directly. None of that was why they had been expelled. They had been expelled because of the Meridian Survey. Commander Ilara Vasquez had led the survey team. She had been 34 years old, a 9-year veteran of deep space cartography, and she had taken a team of 12 into the Karath Corridor, a region of space that the Selethari hegemony, a Council member species, had been in the process of formally claiming for 2 centuries. The survey itself had not been unauthorized, technically. The authorizations were complex, layered, interpreted differently by different parties. What was not in dispute was that Vasquez's team had documented 3 pre-sentient species in the corridor, had filed those findings with the Council, and had then, this was the part that had generated 11 hours of emergency session, refused to leave the corridor until the Selethari agreed to a moratorium on development pending sentience assessment protocols. A 12-person survey team, refusing to leave, in the face of a Selethari fleet that had at its peak numbered 47 vessels. For 6 months, the Council had asked humanity to recall the team. The human government had said, with a diplomatic phrasing that in retrospect contained a very specific kind of quiet, that they would certainly consider all options. The Selethari had on 2 occasions attempted to physically relocate the survey station. The first attempt had resulted in a standoff that lasted 9 days and ended when it became apparent that the survey team had, somehow, made the station's life support systems partially dependent on manual override protocols that only the team members knew. The second attempt had ended when Vasquez personally transmitted, on an open channel, every piece of documentation the team had gathered on Selethari development activities in the corridor, direct to every Council member species simultaneously. After the second incident, the Selethari had called for expulsion proceedings. The vote had been 11-2 with one abstention. Vasquez's team had been recalled 3 days later. They had complied. That was what Veth Ara remembered thinking afterward. They had complied. They had left when told to leave. The situation was resolved. She had been wrong about that too. Marin Vasquez was 8 years old when her mother came home from the Karath corridor. She remembered the way her mother had looked, thinner, quieter, with a particular kind of stillness that settled over her at odd moments, mid-sentence or mid-meal, like she was listening for something that no one else in the room could hear. The expulsion had come 9 months later, and Marin remembered that too, mostly as a texture of adult anxiety that permeated everything. The careful conversations that stopped when she walked into a room, the news feeds her parents thought she wasn't watching, the particular way her mother sat with the notification when it came through, not reading it exactly, just holding it. "What happens now?" Marin had asked. "We figure it out," her mother had said. Which was, Marin would later understand, the most precise answer possible. She was 19 when she joined the Vasquez survey group, which was what her mother had built in the 11 years after the expulsion in the space that the council no longer formally acknowledged. It was not technically a survey group by that point. It had been at the beginning. Ilara Vasquez had returned from the Karath corridor with a reputation that made her unemployable in any council-adjacent enterprise, and a skill set that made her indispensable to every human organization that was no longer worried about council-adjacent employability. She had started mapping the expulsion zone, the 17 systems, plus the additional 43 that existed in the ambiguous frontier space between council-monitored territory and the unknown deep, with the focused energy of someone who had been told the work didn't matter, and had decided to treat that as a hypothesis worth testing. What she had found in those systems was complicated. Marin joined as a junior surveyor and spent her first year doing exactly what the name suggested: surveying. Rock, gas, radiation. The fine detail work of understanding what was actually out there in the space humanity now occupied. She was good at it. She had her mother's ability to sit with uncomfortable data without flinching, to look at a reading that said something inconvenient and continue looking until she understood what it meant rather than until she could explain it away. At 21, she found the relay station. It was not human-built. That was the first thing that was clear. It was not council-built either, and she knew council architecture well enough by then to be certain. It was something else, something older, built from materials that her scanner couldn't fully characterize, broadcasting on frequencies that didn't correspond to any known communications protocol. Broadcasting, present tense. It had been broadcasting, she eventually determined, for somewhere between 800 and 1200 years. She filed a report. She documented everything. She sent it to her mother. Ilara Vasquez sat with that report for 3 weeks before she responded. When she did, her message was 6 words: "Don't tell anyone outside the group." Marin at 21 had wondered why. At 26 she understood. At 26 she had stopped wondering about a lot of things and started focusing entirely on what could be done with what she knew. Counselor Veth Ara's deep analysis came back in segments, which was unusual. Normally the council's analytical systems returned comprehensive reports. The segmented delivery meant that the systems were encountering data that didn't parse cleanly against existing frameworks, data that required iterative recategorization before it could be presented in a form that made sense. The first segment covered human economic activity in the expulsion zone. This was where Veth Ara had expected to find the obvious: a species cut off from council resources, struggling to maintain technological sophistication, probably declining. What she found instead was a network of resource extraction and processing operations that had grown over 11 years, to a scale that was difficult to quantify because they had developed their own internal trade systems that didn't interface with any council economic framework. They had built parallel systems. Not because the council systems were unavailable. There were still, technically limited commercial access provisions in the expulsion agreement, but because they had apparently decided that parallel was better. That dependency in one direction was a vulnerability. That the lesson of the Karath corridor apparently had been about leverage. The second segment covered human population distribution. This was where Veth Ara first felt the particular quality of cold that would not leave her for the remainder of her investigation. Humanity had not concentrated in the original 17 systems. They had expanded carefully, methodically, using survey data that was more comprehensive than anything the Council's own exploratory corps had produced for that region, into 43 additional systems. They had not claimed these systems under any framework the Council recognized. They had simply moved into them and begun the work of understanding them with a thoroughness that, in the analytical report's dry language, was described as atypical for a newly arrived species. They were not a newly arrived species. They had been there for 11 years. But the phrasing nagged at Veth Ara because it implied something the report wasn't saying directly: that the humans were behaving in these systems as though they intended to be there for much longer than 11 years. As though they were building something that operated on a timeline the Council hadn't thought to account for. The third segment was delayed by 4 days while the analytical systems performed additional calibration. When it arrived, Veth Ara read it 3 times, then called her aide and told him to clear her schedule for the next week. The humans had established contact with the entity broadcasting from the relay station. Not recent contact. Contact that, based on the communication record fragments the analysis had managed to reconstruct, appeared to have begun approximately 9 years ago, 2 years after the expulsion. The analytical systems flagged this with a confidence interval of 63% not certain but not ignorable. What was more certain, at 87% confidence, was what the analytical systems characterized as ongoing bilateral information exchange of unknown scope. Unknown scope. Veth Ara sat with that phrase for a long time. Then she began making a list of questions in order of what she most needed to know. The first question was, who or what had been broadcasting from that relay station? The second was, what had the humans exchanged? The third, and this was the one that kept interrupting the others, was, why had the humans told no one? She already suspected the answer to the third question. She didn't want to be right. The thing that most people misunderstood about Alara Vasquez, Marin had come to believe, was that they thought her defining characteristic was stubbornness. The Karath corridor story had calcified that interpretation. Here was a woman who simply refused to move, who held a position past the point of rationality, who confused obstinacy with principle. Even within the survey group, even among people who admired her, that was the story. Alara Vasquez who wouldn't leave. But Marin had watched her mother work for 7 years by the time the relay station contact was established, and what she understood was that stubbornness was the wrong word. Stubbornness implied that the position didn't change. What her mother actually had was something different, a willingness to stay with a problem until she understood it. Those were not the same thing. Stubbornness was about not moving. What her mother had was about not looking away. And those two things could look identical from a distance, but the difference between them was the entire difference between what the council thought had happened in the Karath corridor and what had actually happened. In the Karath corridor, Alara Vasquez had not been refusing to leave because she was unable to accept defeat. She had been refusing to leave because she had been watching the Selethari development activities, and she had understood, in the way that she understood things, by looking directly and without flinching, that the pre-sentient species in the corridor would not survive the development unless someone remained present to document it in real time. She had understood that the Council's assessment protocols had a processing delay of approximately 8 months. She had understood that 8 months was more than enough time for development activities to render the question of sentience assessment moot. She had made a calculation, and the calculation had concluded that the only leverage available was presence. Physical, documented, undeniable presence. The cost of that calculation had been the expulsion. She had known that. She had filed an impact assessment before the second incident with the Selethari, which Marin had found in her mother's files years later. A careful, precise document that outlined the probable consequences of escalation and concluded, in the dry language her mother used for the things that mattered most to her, that the expected outcome, while adverse to human council membership in the short term, represents an acceptable cost given the alternative. Acceptable cost. Marin had read that phrase at 23 and felt something complicated move through her. She had read it again at 27 and understood it differently. She was 30 now, and she understood it in a way that was no longer complicated, or rather, it was still complicated, but the complication had been integrated into the architecture of how she operated. Humanity had lost its council seat. 31 years of membership, 4 mutual defense pacts, 17 treaties, the entire framework of interstellar legitimacy. Her mother had decided that was an acceptable cost, and her mother had been right, and that rightness was the thing that Marin was still working to fully inhabit. Because the pre-sentient species in the Karath corridor were still alive. The moratorium had held, not because the council had enforced it, but because the Selethari had never fully trusted that the humans were actually gone, and uncertainty was its own form of deterrence. 3 species still alive, still developing, somewhere in a disputed corridor that humanity no longer had any formal relationship with. Because of 6 months of refusal and the acceptable cost of everything that followed. Marin thought about that a lot. She thought about the relay station. She thought about what it had been broadcasting for 800 years and to whom, and why the timing of everything felt like something that was not random, and whether her mother had understood that from the beginning or had arrived at it the way she arrived at everything else, by looking directly without flinching until the shape of the thing became clear. She was working on a message to her mother when the alert came through. Council survey vessel crossing into the frontier space. Not the expulsion zone, they had technically stayed out of the expulsion zone, which was itself interesting. They were just outside its boundary in the ambiguous region. They were not supposed to be there, they were there anyway. Marin sent the alert to her mother and waited. Her mother's response came back in 11 minutes. It was again 6 words. This time they were, "It is time, come home." Marin had not known until that moment that there was a home to come back to. Veth Ara had authorized the survey vessel crossing herself. She had done it quietly without full council knowledge, which was a violation of protocols that she had over her career treated as sacrosanct. She had done it because the third segment of the analytical report had been followed, 4 days later, by a fourth segment that she had not requested and that her aide had not been able to explain. A segment that appeared to have been added to the report from an external source, inserted into the council's analytical systems through a method that the security team was still investigating. The fourth segment contained a single document. It was a survey report, formatted in standard xenobiological notation, covering a region of space that the Council's maps showed as uncharted deep frontier. The report documented a sapient species of considerable technological development that had, according to the report's dating analysis, achieved its current level approximately 600 years ago, and had since been engaged in what the report characterized as deliberate withdrawal from detectable activity, hiding. A civilization hiding. The report included coordinates, spectral analyses, communication frequency data, and a translation index for what appeared to be a preliminary common language. The report was dated 11 years ago, 3 months after the expulsion, and at the bottom, in plain language rather than technical notation, was a single sentence: "We did not find this because we were looking. We found this because we were expelled to the space where they were hiding, and we stayed long enough that they decided to let us know they were there." Veth Ara had sat with that sentence for a very long time, because the implication was impossible to avoid. Humanity had not stumbled into this. Humanity had been not placed in the expulsion zone, not positioned, nothing so deliberate as that, but the expulsion had put them in a space that the Council had never looked at carefully, and they had looked at it carefully with 11 years of meticulous attention, and the hidden civilization had made contact, and the hidden civilization had been broadcasting from that relay station for 800 years. And the relay station broadcasts were not distress signals or territorial markers or anything the Council's analytical categories had a name for. They were, as best the analytical systems could determine, invitations. The hidden civilization had been inviting someone in, for 800 years, and the only species that had arrived, that had stayed, that had looked without flinching at what was actually there, had been humanity, expelled, reduced, officially without standing in the interstellar community. And somehow, in that reduction, in that expulsion, they had walked directly into the thing that the hidden civilization had been waiting 8 centuries for someone to find. This was why the survey vessel was crossing into frontier space. Veth Ara needed to know how far it had gone, how deep the exchange had been. What humanity had learned from 800 years of accumulated knowledge from a civilization that had chosen to hide rather than reveal itself to the Council, and had chosen to reveal itself to humanity instead. What she didn't know, what she was beginning to understand she needed to know urgently before she took another step, was why. Why had the hidden civilization chosen humanity? What had they seen in those 11 years of careful observation that had convinced them? What did humanity have or do or be that had qualified them in the eyes of a species old enough and sophisticated enough to have spent 8 centuries filtering their candidates? She was still working on that question when the survey vessel made contact with a Vasquez survey group vessel at the frontier boundary, and the message came back to the Council through standard diplomatic channels, and Veth Ara read it standing up because she had been standing when it arrived and she found she couldn't make herself sit down. "Counselor Veth Ara, we have been expecting your inquiry. Ambassador Vasquez requests a meeting at your earliest convenience." She suggests the council chamber. She notes that her seat is still there. Ilara Vasquez was 58 years old when she walked back into the council chamber. She walked in alone, which was not protocol, and she walked in without announcement, which was also not protocol, and she sat down in the chair at the slightly wrong angle and she waited. She had, Marin would later learn, been completely calm, not the stillness of someone suppressing emotion. Actual calm. The calm of someone who had spent 11 years in hard space, in resource-limited systems, in close quarters with a hidden civilization that thought in frameworks humanity was still learning to map, and had come through all of it with a particular quality of settled attention that was, in its own way, more unsettling than agitation would have been. Veth Ara arrived with 4 other counselors. She had told them only that a contact had arrived. She hadn't told them who. The moment of recognition, Veth Ara had replayed it many times afterward, was not dramatic. There was no gasp, no visible reaction, just the particular quality of stillness that spread through the room like a temperature drop as Ilara Vasquez looked at the assembled counselors with the expression that Veth Ara had been trying to categorize for 11 years. She understood it now, finally. It was not defeat. It had never been defeat, it was patience. Specifically, the patience of someone who knew something you didn't and was willing to wait until you were ready to hear it. "You read the 4th segment," Vasquez said. "It was not a question." "We have many questions," Veth Ara said. "I know. Vasquez was quiet for a moment, not because she was composing her thoughts but because she seemed to be making a decision about something, about which door to open first. "Before I answer any of them," she said, "I need you to understand something about the Karath corridor." Veth Ara had not expected this, none of them had. "The Karath corridor was 11 years ago." "Yes," Vasquez said, "and it's directly relevant to every question you have." She leaned forward slightly, and the 5 counselors found themselves doing the same involuntarily, which Marin, watching on relay from outside the council complex, would later describe as the moment she knew the meeting was going to go the way her mother had predicted it would. "You expelled us because we refused to leave," Vasquez said. "The Selethari complained and you voted and you removed us from the council. What you decided in that vote was that we were a destabilizing element. That our behavior was irrational. That a 12-person team maintaining a position against 47 vessels was not rational action." She paused. "You were right that it wasn't rational. You were wrong about what that meant." "What did it mean?" Councillor Drevshaw, the Selethari representative, asked. His voice was flat in the way that indicated in Selethari emotional vocabulary extreme suppression of agitation. "It meant we were not operating on the same calculus as you." Vasquez's voice was even, not cold. "Even, you calculated that the cost was too high. We calculated that there were 3 species in that corridor that wouldn't exist in 8 months if we left. The math wasn't complicated. The only difference was which variables we decided were non-negotiable. You lost your council membership." "We did. Was that worth it to you?" Vasquez looked at Drevshaw for a long moment. "The species are still alive," she said. The silence that followed was, by Marin's estimate on the relay feed, approximately 40 seconds. It felt longer. "The relay station," Veth Ara said finally. "Tell me about the relay station." Vasquez's expression shifted slightly, not much, but enough. "Quorum," she said, which was the first time that word had ever been spoken in a council chamber, and which the councillors did not yet understand was the name of the hidden civilization, had been observing council space for approximately 800 years. They decided fairly early in that observation period that they were not going to initiate contact with the council. They set up the relay stations as a different kind of invitation, one that required a certain quality of attention to notice. Most civilizations in council space never developed in directions that brought them through the deep frontier regions. The ones that did were usually traveling in a straight line between somewhere and somewhere else. They didn't stop. They didn't look carefully. They didn't stay, Veth Ara said. "Stay," Vasquez agreed. "The quorum told us in the second year of contact that they had been waiting for a civilization that would be expelled or exiled or isolated into the frontier, and then stay anyway. Stay and look, not because they had nowhere else to go, because they were curious about what was actually there." She folded her hands on the table. "We were not the first expelled species in the history of council governance. We were the first that treated the expulsion as an exploration rather than a punishment." Drevshaw made a sound that his translator rendered as involuntary respiratory disruption. In plain language, this was the Selethari equivalent of having the breath knocked out of you. "How much," Veth Ara said carefully, "have they shared with you?" Vasquez's expression did the thing again, that fractional shift. "I need you to understand that this is not a leverage conversation," she said. "I want to be very clear about that. We're not here to bargain with what we've learned. We're here because the quorum asked us to initiate formal contact, and formal contact requires a council structure and you are the council." She paused. "But I'll answer your question honestly because you deserve that. They've shared 11 years of continuous exchange. They're a pre-collapse civilization, old enough to have direct memory through their records of the last time the deep frontier contained an active civilization. They've given us every piece of archival data they have on what worked, what failed, and why. They've given us their complete understanding of the 17 species in the uninventory deep frontier that the council doesn't know exist. They've given us," she stopped, appeared to consider something. "This is the part where I need you to not react immediately. The council did not manage this, they reacted immediately." 17, Drevshaw said. 17 intelligent species at varying development stages, all aware of the council, all choosing for their own reasons not to make contact. She let that settle. "The quorum has been their intermediary, monitoring, maintaining a certain equilibrium. They needed to hand that responsibility off to a council-recognized species because they're—" She paused again, and this pause was different from the others. "Less controlled, more genuine. They're dying, not quickly, but their population has been declining for 200 years. They chose withdrawal because they were exhausted, not because they were afraid, and they needed someone to take over the work before they were gone." The silence this time was longer than 40 seconds. "They chose us," Veth Ara said. "Not quite a question. They chose us," Vasquez confirmed. "Because you refused to leave the Karath corridor," Drevshaw said. His voice had changed entirely. "Because we stayed when the calculus said go. Because we kept looking when looking was no longer advantageous. Because we treated 17 systems of empty space as worth understanding rather than worth escaping." She looked at each counselor in turn slowly. The quorum's word for it translates imperfectly, but the closest approximation is those who finish the sentence. Civilizations that, when they start something, don't stop until they understand what they started. Marin was in the corridor outside the council chamber when her mother came out, 2 hours later. The counselors had needed time to debrief, to begin processing, to start the procedural mechanisms of what came next. Readmission proceedings, formal quorum contact protocols, the 17 species question that would occupy the council for years. There were frameworks to build, all of them new, because none of the old frameworks applied to any of this. Ilara Vasquez walked out of the chamber and found her daughter in the corridor, and the two of them stood there for a moment in the way they always stood together, close enough that the silence felt complete rather than empty. Did they understand? Marin asked. Some of it. Her mother looked tired in a way she didn't usually let show. Not exhausted, tired like someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had just put it down, and the relief of the absence was its own kind of weight. They'll understand more as they go, that's how understanding works. The quorum condition, Marin said. Are you going to tell them? Vasquez was quiet for a moment. Not today. The quorum condition was the piece that Marin had known would be the hardest to communicate because it was the piece that most clearly explained why the quorum had chosen humanity and not the council, and that explanation was not comfortable. The quorum had not given humanity their archives and their knowledge of the 17 species and their 800 years of careful stewardship as a gift. They had given them as a test, a continuing test. The condition of the transfer was not political or technological, it was behavioral. The inheriting species had to demonstrate in ongoing practice that they were those who finished the sentence, that they would not stop when the calculus said stop. That the 17 species in the deep frontier would have in humanity what the 3 species in the Karath corridor had briefly had. Someone present, looking, unwilling to look away. The condition had a failure mode. If humanity ceased to demonstrate the quality, if they assimilated back into council behavior patterns, if they optimized and rationalized and learned to leave when leaving was logical, the quorum's remaining population would withdraw the relationship entirely and find another candidate if there was time. If there was not time, the 17 species would be on their own. The council would need to know this eventually. But what they needed to know first, what Vasquez had spent the meeting making sure they understood, was not the condition, it was the choice. That humanity had not earned this because they were stronger or more advanced or more sophisticated. They had earned it because they had been expelled and had kept going. They had been reduced and had kept looking. They had lost everything the council thought was worth having and had treated that loss as a starting point rather than an ending. They're afraid of us, Marin said. It was not quite a question. They're beginning to be. Her mother looked at her with the expression that was not quite a smile but occupied the same space. They thought when they voted to expel us that they were removing an irrational element from the system. Instead, they introduced that irrational element into the only region of space where irrationality was the correct selection pressure. She was quiet for a moment. Drev Shah asked me at the end of the session whether we would have found the quorum if we hadn't been expelled. What did you say? I told him I didn't know. I think we would have gone looking eventually, but the expulsion, she stopped. Looked at the corridor ceiling with an expression Marin recognized as the one she wore when she was doing the kind of looking that had no object, the kind that was entirely internal. The expulsion gave us the space, literally, and the necessity. And it gave us the particular quality of attention you develop when you've lost the thing you thought you needed, and you have to figure out what's actually still there. They walked out of the council complex together in the early planetary morning, into cold air, and the particular quality of light that falls on a world that is not yours but is for the moment where you are. Marin thought about the quorum, ancient and declining, watching from their hiding places for 8 centuries. She thought about 17 species choosing invisibility, waiting to see what kind of civilization found them first. She thought about 3 species in a corridor that no 12-person survey team should have been able to protect, and that was still alive because of 6 months of refusal and 11 years of consequences that her mother had called an acceptable cost. She thought about her own life, the surveys, the relay station, the careful, meticulous years of understanding what was actually out there. And she thought about the thing she hadn't told her mother yet, which was that in the 3rd month of the Deep Frontier survey she had completed 6 weeks ago, in a system the quorum archives listed as uncontacted, she had picked up a signal, not from the system itself, from something in transit. Something small and fast and broadcasting on frequencies that matched nothing in any of the databases, quorum or council or human, something new, something that hadn't been there before, something that was, she suspected, going to require a very particular kind of attention. She hadn't told anyone yet, she was still looking. She would keep looking until she understood it. That was how they did things. Veth Ara returned to the chamber with the empty chair, late in the evening, after the other counselors had gone. She stood at the doorway for a long time and then, because she couldn't help it, because it was the only thing that made sense to do, she walked to the chair and she sat in it. She sat in the chair at the slightly wrong angle and she tried to inhabit for a moment what it would feel like to sit here and know what Alara Vasquez had known. To know that the vote was 11-2 and that you were being expelled and that the thing you had seen and the choice you had made and the cost you were paying was correct. Not justifiable, correct. She tried to feel what it would take to believe that losing your council seat was an acceptable cost. To believe it not as a rationalization or a consolation but as a genuine calculation, clear-eyed and unflinching. She sat in the chair for a long time and she discovered, to her discomfort and her fascination and something else that she didn't immediately have a category for, that she could not feel it. She could understand it, the logic of it, the architecture of it. But the place where she would need to feel it was a place she had never been. She had no framework for it. No species she had ever studied had that place in the same way, and the quorum had apparently spent 8 centuries learning that, testing it, filtering for it. Outside, the planetary morning was becoming planetary day, and somewhere in the deep frontier a woman was looking at a signal from something new, something that hadn't been there before, and she was looking at it with the particular quality of attention that did not flinch, not because she had been told to, not because it was strategic. Because that was what they did. Because that was, apparently, what they had always done, before the council, before the stars, in whatever smaller version of the same problem they had faced when they were still bound to a single world, looking up at a sky full of signals they didn't understand yet, staying up past every reasonable hour, refusing to stop until they knew. The galaxy had a great deal left to learn about what that meant. Veth Ara was no longer certain the learning would be comfortable. She was not certain it was supposed to be.